This is the Trek Fuely X 9.8 29er. It's Trek's short travel 29er trail bike. It's definitely not a cross-country bike, but it's a lot of fun on the trails. So before we get into how it rides, here's a quick rundown of the specs. It's got 130mm of travel front and rear, using Fox's 34 performance fork and Trek's ABP suspension system with their reactive damper. On our scales it weighs 13.9 kilograms, so it's by no means light, but it's got a 67-degree head angle, which is nice and slack, a real stiff frame and a Burly wheel set, so it descends really nicely for a bike of this travel. Those wheels use the Boost hub standard for added stiffness, which was pioneered by Trek. They also have 30mm internal width on the rims, giving those 2.4-inch tyres lots of support and extra volume. We've got a SRAM 1x11 drivetrain, their Guide RS brakes, and a suite of Bontrager finishing kit. All in all, it's a relatively burly build for a bike of this travel. Something Trek has developed across a range of their bikes for 2017 is this knock block headset. Basically, it limits the steering lock so that your fork doesn't hit into the down tube in a crash. This allows them to make a straighter down tube, which they say is stiffer for a given weight. Much like riding a dual crown fork, you don't really notice it at all while you're riding. The only thing with it is that if you wanted to change to a shorter, or if you're a bit mental, longer stem, you're going to have to go with one of Trek's knock block stems, so that kind of limits your options a little bit there. In a sense, Trek's ABP suspension system is essentially a linkage-driven single pivot layout, because the rear axle is connected to the main pivot by an uninterrupted chainstay. But in another sense, it's much more like a horse link design, because the rear brake caliper is connected to the seat stay and not the chainstay. What that means is you get less anti-rise or less brake jack, so that when you're on the brakes, the suspension is less affected. It becomes less firm under braking. So you should get better sensitivity and traction under braking than you would on a conventional linkage-driven single pivot system like you would see on a Kona, for example. But the really interesting thing about this bike is the reactive damping tune. Basically what this means is you have quite a lot of low-speed compression to resist kind of pedaling and pumping forces. But there's a valve inside which opens up at higher speeds to allow the suspension to remain active over kind of bigger hits. On the trail though, you'll notice that there is actually quite a lot of pedal bob. It's not a naturally efficient suspension design. In the firmest mode, it will still bob a little bit, not like a conventional Fox DPS shock, which is pretty much a full lockout. This will allow a little bit of suspension bob. But the flip side is that even in that firmest mode, when you hit a bump, it will react to it. So the reactive valving does work quite well in that sense. You can have a mode that is both fairly efficient under pedaling and fairly active under kind of big hits. Also, even in the lightest compression setting, the fairly high degree of low-speed compression does affect suspension sensitivity, particularly on small bumps, things like roots and rocks and what have you. So if you're about all-out descending performance, I think a more traditional damping curve with kind of slightly less low-speed compression works a bit better in terms of traction and what have you. But for trails where you want to do a lot of efficient pedaling and still have a suspension system that's pretty active over the bumps, it's actually quite a good compromise. Especially if you leave it in the mid setting, it works pretty well for most kind of pedally trail center scenarios. It has got this minnow link which allows you to adjust the geometry, but we left it in the lowest slackest mode pretty much the whole time. That gives you a 335mm bottom bracket height, which is moderately low, and a 67-degree head angle, which is really slack for a bike of this type. That means that the steering is nice and predictable. The bottom bracket height is low enough to keep it nice and agile when you're switching between left and right turns. That slack head angle also allows you to attack kind of steep technical descents much more easily than other bikes of this category. And to be honest, I really don't feel like it makes it feel lazy or slow in tight corners at all. The low setting gives you a seat angle of about 74.5 degrees. That's the effective seat angle. That obviously depends a little bit on how tall you are. But for me, it's just about steep enough. And pretty much the only reason I was tempted to switch to the higher setting was to get a steeper seat angle, to make it easier on the climbs. Which sort of makes me wonder, why wouldn't you have the steeper seat angle from the higher setting with the lower bottom bracket and the slacker head angle from the low setting kind of at the same time? it kind of seems weird to have to switch between one or the other. You definitely don't want that bottom bracket height to be any higher. I don't see any reason to have that head angle being any steeper, but I do see an advantage to having that steeper seat angle. Having said that, even in the slacker mode, the seat angle isn't too slack, so it will get you up there even on pretty steep climbs. It's not light and it's not particularly efficient, so it's not the fastest climber, but it will get you there. On flatter kind of trail center terrain, these Bontrager XR3 tires roll really fast. They're quite big at 2.4 inches wide, which kind of takes the sting out of rougher trails. Also makes them roll faster if the terrain is rough. A bit like a Plus tire, but obviously to a smaller extent. These are on quite wide 30mm rims, which means you can run quite low pressures without them feeling too vague and squirmy. Having said that, they have almost no kind of edging tread at all, so they're very drifty, especially on the front. So you might want to upgrade to a slightly meatier tire if you're riding, especially in the UK. But it's on the descents where the bike really excels. It's got a wide bar, relatively short stem, nice stiff frame and stiff wheel set. You can really kind of chuck it into corners. It's a lot of fun on kind of tight twisting terrain. It also feels quite poppy over kind of jumps and pumping of trail center type terrain. So overall it's very kind of capable and a lot of fun on the descents. So it's not the fastest climber, but it's actually really good for kind of covering long distances. It's quite a comfortable bike and it rolls quite well over rough terrain, which is why, despite all the bikes that I have access to, I chose to take this bike when I went to Gran Canaria for a bike packing trip. And despite loading it up with a lot of unnecessary stuff and chucking it down some actually pretty technical descents, it handled that really well, so I think it was a good choice for that trip. So it's no race bike, but whether you want to do a lap of your local trail centre or chuck it down some pretty gnarly descents, or even do a pretty kind of long distance epic ride, it's a really good choice for that kind of riding.